wonderful, growing. It just simply proves the truth of the message that we preached this morning. That the gospel of Jesus Christ, and that each one of us must determine in our heart and life that we want to preach the word. Let others know that we stand for the Lord Jesus Christ.
Memories of Clyde True are fading. I remember opening presents on Christmas Eve at his house. I remember him making kids laugh by flipping his upper denture in his mouth. You may know the name Clyde True, you may not. He was a preacher, an entrepreneur, an evangelist, a war veteran, a father, and a dreamer. And when he passed away 20 years ago, literally hundreds of people came to pay their respects and to tell a story about how he touched their lives. My name is Jeff True, and Clyde True was my grandfather. In January 2004, I began a project to discover Clyde True, to find out what was special about this man, and to find out why so many people considered him a mentor and a friend. Clyde was born on July 2, 1925, in the small town of Smithfield, Kentucky, to Raymond and Ethel True. Clyde was the baby of the family.
He had the two brothers. Carl was the oldest, and then Ray and then Clyde.
Times were different. The Depression made work hard to find. Clyde's father worked as a carpenter. His mother would bake bread and go door to door to sell it. While Clyde was still a baby, they packed up and moved to Akron, Ohio. 15 years older, Clyde's brother Carl was basically an adult as Clyde was growing up. But Ray was the big brother that Clyde really leaned on.
They had a good relationship, totally different worlds. Uncle Ray was more military, so to speak, straight down the line, very businesslike, and Dad was just the opposite, free-spirited, don't worry about it.
Clyde just idolized Ray. He wanted to be just like Ray. I've heard him say before at church that it was good for Clyde that Ray left, because Clyde just followed Ray and wouldn't do anything on his own.
In 1941, Clyde's family moved back to Louisville and they began attending West End Christian Church. This was a time of uncertainty. The German army was on the move in Europe, then the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor.
I definitely remember the day when Pearl Harbor was hit. It was a Sunday afternoon, and Mother was laying down, and I was sitting at the kitchen table doing my homework. And she said, well, they've declared war on Japan.
Clyde did not finish high school. His father became ill, and Clyde started working full-time to support his family. In 1943, Clyde turned 18 and received his notice for the draft. He was scheduled to leave in October, but that summer Clyde would meet the woman that would change his life. Phyllis Green was born on November 8, 1927, in Springfield, Ohio, to Marcus and Calva Green. To find work, they moved to Washington, Indiana, then to Columbus, Ohio, and eventually to Louisville, Kentucky.
I was 10 and we moved to Louisville here. My dad was offered a maintenance man at the White Castle. He made $25 a week, and I remember my mother saying that our rent was $22.50.
Phyllis stayed busy with school and working part-time. On June 4th, 1943, she met Clyde when she went with her friend Doris Bagley to the movies.
Her boyfriend was Bobby Dragoo. He was Clyde's cousin, and he was an usher there at the Strand Theater. Clyde came in, I remember Bobby Dragoo saying, "Cousin, cousin," and everybody in the theater, I think, heard him. Clyde and I, we hit it off right at the very beginning. He asked me for another date that evening. I thought he was very nice, and he just seemed to me like he had a heart of gold.
Clyde and Phyllis dated steadily over the next 5 months.
He had a car, that was nice, you know. He was the first boy that Mother and Daddy ever let me go out in a car by myself.
Their relationship continued to grow and they fell deeper in love, but life was about to change. I find it interesting how each stage of a person's life seems to prepare them for the future. At 18 years old, Clyde True was about to experience some incredible things in World War II. That experience would lay a foundation for the rest of Clyde's life.
Dad never talked much about World War II.
But he never mentioned anything in World War II.
Dad never talked to me about
He
World
never
War
did
II.
really talk about World War II. Who was you fighting in the war? I was fighting the Germans. That's all he'd say. He'd tell us. He'd give us an answer. But it was a quick, didn't go into any details, and, you know.
On October 20th, 1943, Clyde was drafted into the service, and on November 1st, he reported to Fort Mitchell. After that, he was sent to Fort Sill, Oklahoma for 3 months of basic training.
About his war experiences, one time at my house, my husband and I were sitting around with them, and somehow it got on the war. So Clyde was starting to tell his story. I said, "Would you mind if I just write it down as you tell it?" So he said no, he didn't mind, and I wrote it down as he told it.
Dad was in the 101st Airborne, and he was a radio operator with the Forward Observance Group. He was in the 321st Glider Field Artillery Battalion.
During his time in the service, Clyde had his mind on Phyllis and wrote letters to her constantly. England, July 29th, 1944. Holland, October 31st, 1944. Germany, May 19th, 1945. Dearest darling, I pray that you are feeling fine. As for me, I am okay, but I am getting a little homesick to see Phyllis Green. I guess I'll tell you a little about what I do. I get up at 6:15, then I can fix up my bed. After that, I should be ready for inspection at 7:35. I haven't had a pass since September, and I'm getting tired of this kind of life. Honey, if they keep this up, I think I'll quit this job and come back to you. Ha ha. You never mentioned anything about the male manual game. Who won? I hope we did. Good night, darling. I love you with all my heart. Your Clyde.
Dad, he hated being in service. He didn't want to be there. But it was something he had to do, and he did it. But he'd rather been doing something else.
June 6th, 1944, D-Day. The 101st glided into Normandy.
I asked Dad, I said, "Do you remember D-Day?" "Oh yeah," he said, "I remember D-Day." He said the sky, it seemed like it was just lit up with planes as far as you could see that way and as far as you could see that way. I asked him what outfit he was in. He said, I was in the Army, 101st Airborne, Screaming Eagles, he said. I said, "You guys had to jump out of planes?" And he said, "Yep, had to jump out of planes." "How much time did they give you to train on this stuff to jump out of an airplane?" He said, "Train?" He said, "Mark, they took me up, told me to jump." I asked him, when you were out and you were shooting at people, how did you know you weren't shooting at your own people? And he said the German guns sounded different than the American guns. He said that's about the only way we could tell that who we were shooting at was Germans. The last question I asked him, and it was the one that it just kind of clammed him up, and he didn't talk no more. I asked him if he had ever killed anybody over there. And he looked at me and he said, "Yeah, Mark, I probably did." And that was the end of that.
After D-Day, Clyde's division moved around throughout Europe. They glided into Holland as part of Operation Market Garden. In the middle of that assault, bad news came from home.
In September of '44, his dad passed away. And he was in Europe, and Ray was in the Pacific. And when they telegraphed them for the boys to come home, that their father had died, they didn't get to come. Because if they just said he was sick or at the point of death or something like that, they could have come.
By December 1944, Clyde was in France and making his way to Bastogne into what is now known as the Battle of the Bulge.
I knew Dad was in World War II, but I could not understand why that would make somebody change their life so much. It must have just been just a gut-wrenching time and experience to make him, change thinking, change way of life.
December 1944. The German armies had surrounded the American forces in Bastogne. A telegram to General McAuliffe said surrender or be annihilated. The general's response was one word: nuts. The American armies were focused on holding Bastogne, but the Germans had them surrounded. They were cut off from supplies and holding ground covered in snow up to their knees.
The Germans would holler out, "Hey Joe, hey Joe," and they would try to get the Americans to stick their head up so they could shoot them.
I remember Dad talking about just going through the night and guys would be around in their own foxholes and they'd be talking with one another, and then Dad woke up the next morning and the guys in the foxholes next to him were dead.
Down in the foxhole, the German tanks were close enough that he could clearly hear the German tank commander yelling out the firing orders. So I imagine that'd be pretty scary.
The Germans poured everything on them, and with German tanks and explosives going off all around, Clyde True was in a foxhole with logs over the top.
He's in a foxhole.
He was in a foxhole.
He's surrounded. It doesn't look good.
And there were bombs going off all around him.
Thought he was going to die.
He was praying and he prayed and prayed.
He said, "God, you have got to get me out of here." He said, "If you do," he said, "I'll do it for you."
And he told the Lord, "If you get me out of this alive."
He told the Lord, "If you get me out of here, I'll serve you the rest of my life."
The U.S. armies held Bastogne and Clyde survived, but the fighting continued.
Dad was wounded first week of January 1945. Shrapnel hit his arm. He got better and got to where he could do what he needed to do, and they shipped him right back out to his unit.
In May 1945, the war in Europe ended. As a privilege for standing in Bastogne, the 101st was allowed to go into Hitler's hideaway, Berchtesgaden. Germany, May 19, 1945. My dearest love, I pray that this finds you feeling fine. As for your soldier boy, he is feeling better. I have been having a little trouble with my arm, but honey, don't worry about me. You know, there were things I could not explain up until now, but I don't have to worry now. That is, until I get to the Pacific. Ha ha. I went up to Berchtesgaden this afternoon and looked around Hitler's house. They had a really nice place. But since the Yanks had a party, there isn't much left. I pray that it won't be long until I can be with you. Your Clyde. Shortly after that, the 101st received the devastating news that they were not going home. They were to be shipped to the Pacific operation. They waited for 17 days for the ships to take them, but before they left, the Japanese surrendered. On December 25, 1945, Clyde was on board a ship coming home to New York Harbor.
When he finally got to come home, coming into New York Harbor and seeing the Statue of Liberty, he said that was a good feeling.
Clyde returned to Fort Knox, and on January 6, 1946, he was discharged and received his mustering out pay of $100. After over 2 years of service, Clyde went home to Louisville, Kentucky. He came home having made a promise to God, but it took a few years before it was clear where that promise would take him. When I was growing up, people would hear my last name True and ask me, "Are you related to Clyde True?" I was always impressed with the number of times that happened. Clyde True was a risk taker. He wasn't afraid to go after what he wanted, whether it was a job, a business, or the woman he wanted to marry. Clyde and Phyllis's relationship started right back where it had begun a few years earlier. Throughout the next year, they continued to date and deepen their love.
They both grew up during the Depression. They both went through World War II. They were both church people, Christian people.
Right after he came home, his mother had saved all the money that he had sent her. And that was when he wanted to go in the dry cleaning business.
I just worked at after schools for Clyde when he had the cleaners at 7th in Kentucky. The one thing that stuck in my mind was the way we used to answer the telephone. "Good morning, Colonial Cleaners, Dyers, and Whitewashers. Guaranteed not to rust, wrinkle, or shrink, sag, bag, droop, wear at the knees, rip, fart, snort, or tear at the seams."
While Clyde ran the cleaners, Phyllis worked at Southern Bell as a telephone operator. Clyde and Phyllis began talking about marriage. Phyllis's parents felt like they should wait a few years, but they were anxious to start their life together. So on Saturday, April 26, 1947, Clyde and Phyllis eloped. They were married in a minister's house in southern Indiana. They started out living in a small apartment.
That was a busy time. Clyde went to the church almost every night to help. He helped them put out the church paper. And I would go over to my mother's and sew. I didn't have a sewing machine. Then it was in 1950 that we bought a little house on Nelson.
Clyde continued to run his dry cleaning business, but eventually decided it was time to move on. He took a job driving a bread truck for Tasty Bread Company.
One time he told me he was at Hodgenville, Kentucky, and there was a store owner there that wouldn't put his bread on his shelves. Clyde kept going back and back trying to get him to buy his bread. Somehow they struck up a deal. The guy said if they'd go outside and if Clyde could throw him, he would start putting bread in his store. And so these two grown men went out and started wrestling. And Clyde really put it on him and threw him. And so from that time on, the man started carrying Clyde's bread in his store.
On August 14, 1951, Gary Alvin was born, and things got even more busy for the True family. Robin was born on January 12, 1955. Gary enjoyed being the big brother. They soon realized they were outgrowing their home and decided to move into a bigger house on Shawnee Terrace.
We just lived a few blocks from Fountain Ferry, and Dad taught me how to ride a bike on the sidewalk there next to the house at Shawnee Terrace.
On the outside, life for the True family seemed perfect. Clyde had steady work, they had 2 kids that were doing good, they were deeply involved in the church, but Clyde was struggling with whether he was fulfilling God's purpose for his life.
Jack Noel was the one that really had the impact on Clyde's life. Jack came to West End in 52 or 53, long in there. I never dreamt of such a thing as for him to go into the ministry after we'd been married 11 years. But Jack seemed to think nothing of it. If you go into the ministry and you only get to serve 10 years, well, you get to preach the word for 10 years then.
Dad considered one of the one of the blessings of ministry was to see other men go into the ministry. Clyde was a premier example of that. One of the greatest thrills and satisfactions that God has given me in my ministry has been to witness what He has done in the lives of Clyde and Phyllis True. They heard His call and they left all and followed. Jack Knoll.
Driving the bread truck was just not enough for him, and he felt like, well, he couldn't help but preach the gospel.
I've heard Mom say things in later years that it certainly wasn't a decision that she would have made, but she would not object to doing anything that Clyde felt like he needed to do.
It was like one of those foxhole promises. There came a time when he was reminded of that promise and kept it.
So in the summer of 1958, at the age of 33, Clyde and Phyllis made the life-changing decision to pack up their 2 kids and move on campus at Johnson Bible College in Knoxville, Tennessee.
I asked Mom one time, I said, what made Dad go to Johnson? She said, Terry, he loved Jesus. So
when he came home, he sent for brochures from Johnson Bible College back in '46. 10 years later, he really got serious about it.
I remember that move. I don't remember Dad so much as I remember my mom. She cried. It was a tearjerker of a morning when we pulled out that day to go to Johnson Bible College.
I admire him for it because, he had kids and, a family, and to just pick up and, quit your job and go to college and gonna become a preacher.
When we first went to Johnson, we moved into a house that was on top of the ridge behind the girls' dorm. The first night that we pulled in there, I remember that it was getting dark and Dad was going to sleep out in the car. We weren't in there very long, and Mom heard the rats and the mice. So Dad went and spent the night in the house, and we slept in the car.
Adjusting to the new lifestyle at Johnson was not easy.
His first year of college, he was finishing up his high school requirements and also performing his freshman year in college, and then also maintaining a family of sorts. And Dad had a lot of responsibilities that first year. Had a lot on his mind.
When you take 2 children and move onto a campus and you're a student, it's tough.
The older student had a little bit of experience behind him, good or bad. Clyde experienced war. Clyde experienced the workforce. And Clyde experienced being an elder on the board.
I think he was just so busy he didn't have time for much of anything.
Clyde began a student ministry in the fall of 1959.
Dad preached at Laurel Springs Christian Church. We drove there every Sunday.
And having to drive up through the mountains, seemed like Gary and I, one of us got sick.
It was pretty much a routine that every Sunday Robin would throw up in the back seat.
Through all the busyness of school, Clyde still managed to have fun. He enjoyed bowling and once bowled a perfect game. He also loved playing softball.
Our summers were spent in Pennsylvania. Dad was the manager of Camp Christian. That's when I look back and realize how much Dad knew. He took care of so many things. He operated the lawnmower. If there was a building that had needed repair, well, that's when he showed his carpentry skills. It didn't matter. Whatever was going on, he knew how to take care of it.
The True family grew even bigger on September 26, 1961, when Terry Allen was born. Clyde was balancing his classes, his growing family, and a weekend ministry at Laurel Springs.
Dad was always in the back bedroom studying, and the kids weren't supposed to bother Dad when he's back there studying. You could just hear the 2 fingers pecking away at the typewriter, and he's working on some kind of a paper that he had to do.
Clyde had a passion and a gift for printing church bulletins and newsletters. A standing joke for Clyde was, "Well, I don't have my term paper finished, but you should see my church paper."
The most vivid memory I have was his graduation.
Dad had to finish a paper, graduation night, that had to be turned in if he was going to actually graduate that night.
I remember him having to run out and run down to Dean Clark's house, and he handed something in, it seems like, right there at the end.
In the spring of 1962, Clyde graduated from Johnson Bible College. He was 36 years old and excited to see how God was going to use him.
Johnson was such a special place for him.
I took some time to look through all the copies of Clyde's sermons. Some of them were handwritten, some of them were typed. On the outside of the envelope, he wrote down every time he preached the sermon and where he preached it. Next to that, he marked down the number of responses there were.
When Dad graduated, his first ministry was Mountain View over in Maryville.
He moved his family into our church and we all fell in love with him. He was a very strong minister. He was a very emotional minister, but he was able to touch lives that no one else had seemed to touch in our community.
He was fun to be around. He loved to laugh. I can close my eyes and I can see him and hear him laugh.
Happy-go-lucky fellow, always laughing.
He was preaching and he had dentures, upper dentures, and in the middle of his sermon, his upper denture flew out of his mouth.
And he caught it, and he stuck it right back in his mouth.
And he kind of grabbed it in midair and put it back into his mouth all in one motion.
Dad looked right down at the pianist who was sitting on the front pew and said, "If they come out again, just catch them and throw them back up here, and I'll keep on preaching."
Out here, he would act a fool and cut up. But now when he got behind that pulpit, boy, he was serious.
I don't ever remember him preaching a sermon without shedding tears.
And I remember one time he said, "I almost didn't go into ministry because I'm soft-hearted, and I didn't want people to see me cry. And then I decided that Christ was worth it. So I'm going to preach and I'm going to cry when I get ready to cry."
On March 13, 1964, the True family grew again when Mark Raymond was born. Clyde's ministry at Mountain View continued to flourish. He was always looking for ways to help people in their spiritual walk.
I lived three houses from the church. I started going to Mountain View Church, and Clyde always made me feel welcome and a part of the group right from the start. There were 8 children in my family, and there was just no way I could get a college education. But Clyde said there is a way, and he brought me over here to Johnson Bible College, and Clyde put things into motion. They paid my tuition when I decided to come over here to school.
I do remember one Sunday night we were sitting there and Dad was getting ready to preach, and all of a sudden he looks down at Estill Downey. He says, "Brother Downey, I think maybe we don't want to have this visitor in here with us tonight. Why don't you just escort him out?" And Estill looked over and he said, "Well, I think you're right." And he stood up and walked over and picked up a big old black snake that had just crawled in the sanctuary, and he took it outside.
Clyde, he decided we'd have revival and Bible school at the same time.
We'd have vacation Bible school in the morning for 2 weeks. Then we had revival at night for the same 2 weeks.
And I said, "Clyde, what are you trying to do? Kill us, you know?"
He would fit in with all age groups. That was what's special about him, I think.
He just didn't stay up here long enough. He was a person that liked a challenge. He was one of the best.
Mom and Dad seemed to have a really good relationship. I don't ever remember seeing them argue in front of us.
I'm sure they had their arguments, but I think they did it between themselves and not in front of us kids.
I never saw Mom and Dad argue. I never saw them. I'm not saying they didn't argue. I never saw it. I remember them fussing one time. Mom fixed spinach, and Dad would take the vinegar, put a little vinegar on the spinach and eat it. He took a bite of it, and he spit it out. He said, "This is no good." And Mom goes, "Well, what's wrong with it?" He said, "It just doesn't taste good. Here, taste it." She goes, "I'm not tasting that."
Where they would argue, Dad would go in the kitchen and look for peanut butter, and Mom would hide it.
He bought himself his own jar of peanut butter, and he hid his peanut butter from her. And she found that jar of peanut butter, and she hid that jar of peanut butter from him.
Mom hid the peanut butter behind the books on the bookshelf.
And when he went looking for it that night, he couldn't find it, and she was already in bed. And he went in there and he pulled her out by the feet.
Never talked to me about the birds and bees. With Terry about that one time. "Dad ever talk to you about some of this stuff?" And he goes, "No, I think he skipped a generation."
I mean, he would give me hugs and give Mom hugs, but it wasn't a real gushy. But you never questioned that you weren't loved or that Dad wasn't looking out for your best interest, or that he didn't love our mom. You never questioned that.
Money wasn't big on his agenda, making a lot of money. If he had 10 or 15 or 20 bucks in his pocket, he was ready to go.
We didn't have a lot, and we weren't buying, name brand or items. If you needed a pair of jeans, it wasn't the Lees, it was some off-brand that you never heard of. We always seemed to have enough food on the table.
I never knew what the finances were like and how, if things were really tight or, whatever, but we always had. We never went without a meal unless we got in trouble.
I know just from talking with Mom now as I'm older, she worried about that type of thing, finances and things, but they never showed it to us.
And joining the Boy Scouts, Dad was very supportive of that. When we'd have Court of Honors, he would be right there.
My father had a big impact on my spiritual life. I call it my grace story, but that was about the time when I was making a decision whether to become a Christian or not. I had done something as a young girl that I should never have done. Dad came up and knocked on the door and told me to come out. And when I came out of the room, he just told me to follow him. He turned the corner and he went to this little, we called it the Little Red Store, and as he was going into the store, he told me to wait. He went in, he purchased something, because when he came out, he was carrying a little brown bag, and then he told me to follow him again. When we got back home, he just sat down on the porch and told me to sit down next to him. And he goes, "I know what you did, and it's gonna cost." And he says, "But you're not gonna have to pay the cost." He goes, "I'm gonna take that on. Even though you have done something that is totally wrong, instead of you taking the punishment, you're going to get a reward." So he gives me this bag, and I open it up, and it's full of Tootsie Rolls. Dad's one of his favorite candies. This is what grace is about. You've done something that is wrong, and somebody else has paid the price. And he said, that's just what Jesus Christ has done for you and I. He says, you don't have to worry about what you did. Just, here's the Tootsie Rolls, you can go play. I did. I was shocked. I can't eat a Tootsie Roll without thinking about that.
Dad baptized me.
Dad baptized me.
I was baptized in a horse trough.
I was baptized.
I got baptized.
Dad baptized me at Mountain View.
I've talked with people in my life that don't go to church, and they say they don't go to church because their mom and dad made them go when they was a kid. Well, the reason I go to church today is because my mom and dad made me go when I was a kid. Jesus wasn't shoved down my throat. It was the nucleus of what everything evolved around was church.
He was just special. He was my dad.
I always liked the name True. Grandma said that she used to tell Clyde she married him for his name. It's simple, and yet it seems to mean something. A name to live up to. After 3.5 years as the minister at Mountain View, Clyde began to feel God leading him elsewhere.
My wife and I were going on vacation, and somebody told us that Clyde was looking for another church. And so we went to church service there.
While we were at Mountain View, Carl and Dora Goodlett came one Sunday, just out of the blue. They wanted to hear Clyde preach.
We thought he was a pretty powerful speaker. When he came to Riverside to preach, the people all felt the same way.
In January 1966, Clyde packed up his family and moved to Akron, Ohio to become the minister at Riverside Church of Christ.
There was a lot of energy, and my parents thought there was a lot of potential, and we're getting excited about the new minister coming.
I think everybody loved him from the start. A jolly person, for one thing, full of fun.
He's a very outgoing personality, nothing backward about him.
One of the most reachable ministers we've had.
Just very open. You could talk to him anytime. He would listen.
Probably the silliest minister I knew, because he could get real silly at times. He seemed to be the most serious at times. He was the most emotional at times. Mr. True seemed to go beyond those normal boundaries pretty often.
The reason Dad went to Riverside, I believe, was mainly because they had a vision to grow.
I always felt like he was a man of vision. He was like harnessing all this energy and getting it focused in a good direction.
For years, Riverside had a building fund that monies was being collected into, and it just kind of sat there. And when Clyde came in, I believe in around '66, he got the ball rolling. So he was the catalyst that got things off at dead center.
In the winter of 1967, the Riverside Church broke ground on their new building, and in 1968 they moved in and the church became Northwest Avenue Church of Christ.
He was there every day making sure that the construction was going the way it should be. He continued to be the preacher and continued to be just as concerned about growing the congregation as he was about building the building.
During those years, the True family added 2 more. Lynn Ann was born on March 23, 1968, and David Clyde was born on March 31, 1969. Clyde had a full schedule, but it never seemed to get him down.
I remember a VBS. He did a song, Three Little Pigeons. One pigeon flew away. Second pigeon and third pigeon. Pretty soon, they start coming back.
He would just be so dramatic and just so, into that song.
And he's jumping and acting a fool.
You would think, he's having a revival with the pigeon song. Everybody loved it. You couldn't help but laugh.
I upset him one evening. He was late in the evening service, and I went ahead and started, and he came walking in the back door, and I said, well, here comes the late Clyde True. He didn't tell me, but he told somebody else, if he ever says that again, I'm walking out and going back home.
Those years, late 60s, were, I think, a lot of turmoil in this country, the Vietnam War, race relations. I was the sort of person who always questioned all that, and he would always have answers that would draw me back to the scriptures or put things into kind of an eternal perspective.
Clyde had a way of leading you to do something, and you didn't realize he was leading you to do it. Didn't feel as though he delegated it to you to do. You were doing it with him, I felt.
He was always encouraging you to serve and do more, and he pitched in and was right there along, doing it with you as well.
He got me to do things I never dreamed I could do.
I think he was very creative, and because of that creativity, he could make things more interesting.
He had artistic talent. He could draw, he could paint.
There was the year for Easter, he decided he wanted to rebuild the Garden of Gethsemane and wanted a rock So we ended up getting wood and chicken wire, and he came over to see what we had done. He said, no, bigger, bigger.
Dad, he just wanted to make things big.
Everything he did, if it was going to be done, it was big.
So we did it bigger. So we get paper mache over this chicken wire and everything, paint it. We've done it in the basement, and it will not go up steps. It's too big. He took the railing off my basement steps.
I can remember him saying often that his job as a preacher wasn't to do all the work. He wanted people to learn how to preach and to teach and to do all of those things, so that at some point he could move on and go to another work.
Clyde had the heart of an artist. His love for printing never stopped. He was always printing church bulletins, tracts, flyers. He just loved the graphic arts. He eventually bought a printing press to print church papers. This would turn into a business called True & Associates Creative Printing that he used to support his preaching ministry.
We just got through printing a catalog for the White Fish Company up there in Mogadore, Ohio, and boy, it was a 3-color job, and it really turned out great.
After 7 years as the minister at Northwest Avenue, Clyde again began to hear the call of God.
It was my junior year in high school. Dad came to me and said that we're thinking about moving. How do you feel about it? Just him wanting to know how I felt before we made that move really impacted me.
In 1973, Clyde and Phyllis packed up their family and moved to Louisville, Kentucky.
Dad was a preacher at Highland Park, so we were in the parsonage.
I remember Dad preaching. I mean, when he preached, I mean, he really got into it, and he was just so passionate about it.
He wasn't afraid to get emotional about it, or to get angry about it, or, you know, if he's reading about the money changers in the temple, you know, he would show that anger. He was willing to bear it all, I guess, and show people what he felt about what he was preaching about.
Clyde, to talk about the Bible and Christ, it was like throwing a dog a bone. I mean, he was ready.
It just seemed like something with a spring in him that will preach.
He'd pull out a scripture and say, that will preach. That will preach.
He was always the extreme. I mean, if you were happy, he was happier. If you were serious about something, he went even deeper. And that was Dad.
He was fun to be around. He'd talk about something and then he'd slap that old leg, you know.
That's right.
You couldn't embarrass him because he would do things to embarrass himself and then make a big joke about it and everybody have a good laugh. You know, it was just fun. Dad was just fun.
Throughout his years as a minister, Clyde always had fun and occasionally would play pranks on other people.
Dad would call up people, change his voice around.
But he'd call our church and want to speak to the pastor. He'd call about September or something like that, and he wanted to get his name in for one of the Thanksgiving baskets that we were preparing for the needy, and he'd like to get his name in.
He would call someone up on the phone and he would say, well, brother, you're looking good.
We had a couple here in Louisville. The man's name was Homer Swindell. They were holding a revival. Homer had Clyde to print up the flyers announcing the revival.
Dad printed up a flyer and put a picture of this big hog and put Homer Swindell.
Well, he didn't run them all that way. He just ran a few copies. And when he handed those out to Homer, Homer saw that and he went straight up in the air. I mean, he got angry at Clyde.
I was a good kid. You know, Dad never did call me out from the pulpit.
And if you did anything wrong, Dad would not hesitate to correct you from the pulpit. I remember David getting in trouble once.
I might have gotten called out from the pulpit, but it's been blocked out of my memory. I don't remember that one.
After 6 years as the minister at Highland Park, Clyde decided to make another career change. In 1979, he decided to go into full-time evangelism. He would go to different churches and lead revivals.
Besides just being a preacher, Dad was an evangelist. He loved holding revivals.
He knew it was going to be hard, but he just felt a compelling urge to do this. He did it well, and I was amazed at how many revivals he conducted.
I think to myself, how in the world did he support the family? You know, just going from little church to little church and preaching to people. But, you know, I guess God always provided.
You knew that he was a man of God, and if he felt something was wrong, he was not afraid to take his stand against it, even if he stood alone.
Not that Dad was perfect. I think it was more he was just consistent. He never wavered, never compromised.
If there was a servant's heart, that was Dad. He never thought twice about giving up something for somebody or doing something for somebody.
Reaching out to people and talking to people, that was job one. He was doing that all the time. There's some people that moved in down from us. Dad went fishing or something, and he caught this bass. He hollered down there and said, "Hey, do you know how to clean a fish?" And the guy said, "Yeah, I know." Mom goes, "You know how to clean that. Don't bother him with that." And he said, "I'm going to go down there and talk to him." And he did. That was something he would do. Just play ignorant, you know, on how to clean. And then you can get somebody down there and talk to him a little bit.
Clyde passed away on February 17, 1985, at the age of 59. I was 11 years old when he died, and his funeral is the first that I remember going to. At the time, I didn't realize that all funerals weren't like his.
I left for church that Sunday morning, and he was sitting on the floor in front of the couch, leaned up against the back of the couch, and he had his Bible up there, looking at his sermon like he did every Sunday. And I said to him, I said, "I'm gone." He said, "Okay." And that's the last time I saw him.
I went off to church, and that was the last time I saw him alive.
It was a shock, total shock. And there's a little bit of feeling responsible for it, because the night he died, I was driving the station wagon. It was snowy that evening, and we had a flat tire. And here I was driving. I thought for sure I had done something wrong. He was getting out of the car and told us, you know, just to wait here until he got back. It was strange. I was watching him walk down the ramp from the rear view mirror, and I thought, you know, it's like last time I'm gonna see him, to walk away. It was just a weird feeling, as that was my last time to see him alive.
And the first thing I thought was, he's had a heart attack. That's the first thing I thought.
As we got to the hospital, we were walking out. The ambulance pulled up, and they wheeled Dad out on the gurney, and had one of the EMS guys just up on top of him.
When I got down there was all kinds of people in the emergency room, and I just thought, oh no, something's not right.
I got down there and I turned the corner and there was Mom. I go, "What?" And Mom said, "Your daddy's gone." And I remember looking over at Steve Wolf, and he just looked away from me and just couldn't believe it.
Everything was altered. Life was never the same after that.
At the funeral home that night, the line to come by and view the body and come by the casket there and talk with Mom, the line went on out to the parking lot.
We had a huge line of people just coming through and telling us lots of stories of how Dad influenced them to become a Christian or to accept Christ.
I remember one fella coming up and shaking hand with Mom, and he said, "You don't know me, but was in a situation and I needed some money." And Mr. True gave me his last $20 bill.
When I was sitting there at the funeral, and I was considering the fact that my parents had honored Clyde's life by naming me after him. There's never been a day go by from that point in time that I'm not proud that my middle name is Clyde.
At the funeral, it was, it was standing room only.
I was just amazed at the people, the amount of people that were there. And I don't know if I realized what was going to happen when we went from the church to the cemetery.
There's a police cruiser ahead of us, and he had stopped any of the traffic from getting on the Watterson Expressway.
I remember some of the police officers, they stood at attention as we drove by.
The police chief calls Mom up before the funeral and says, "Don't worry about a police escort. I've got that covered." And he certainly did.
I've always questioned God, why? Why? I don't have an answer.
I guess I just, would wonder what he would think now, or what he would say now.
You wish you could spend just 5 minutes with him. And boy, if I knew, what I know now, I would be asking him, tell me about this, tell me about this.
Clyde's death came as a shock to everyone. Everyone misses him, but the fruit of Clyde's labor can be seen in many places. Throughout his 59 years on this earth and 26 years in the ministry, his influence on people was everywhere. Clyde performed weddings, he led people into the ministry.
They're spread out all over. They're missionaries and they're preachers.
He inspired and supported missionaries.
I think if he could have got on the plane and gone with us, he would have.
And there are countless people that Clyde led to Christ and baptized.
You look back, it had to happen because if Dad had not gone into the ministry, he would not have gone to JBC. Robin would not have gone to JBC. Lynn would not have gone to JBC. Gary would not have gone to JBC, and if he had not been there. I think God had a bigger plan, even beyond Dad and his life.
Was Clyde True a great man? Well, you won't find his name in the history books, but I'd say that if you're looking for a role model, he could be a pretty good choice. He left a legacy. It was a legacy that was born with a promise to God in a foxhole during World War II. Lots of foxhole promises have been made, but Clyde True's is one that came to life. His legacy continues on today through the lives of his family, his friends, and those he impacted. And when people ask, I'll respond proudly, yeah, I'm related to Clyde True. He was my grandpa.